In 1856, a gunsmith named Rollin White held a patent that would make another company a fortune, and it very nearly did not happen at all. White, a former Colt employee, had patented a bored-through cylinder design, a revolver cylinder drilled all the way through so it could be loaded with a self-contained metallic cartridge from the rear rather than packed with loose powder and ball from the front, the way every earlier revolver design required. Two Connecticut gunmakers named Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson approached White with an offer 25 cents in royalty on every revolver built using his patent in exchange for exclusive rights to the design for as long as the patent itself remained valid. White agreed, and in doing so signed away considerably more than he ever fully understood he was giving up at the time. The arrangement left White personally responsible for defending his own patent in court against every infringer who tried to copy it, a legal burden that would eventually bankrupt him entirely, while the company that had licensed his invention from him grew into one of the most recognizable names in the history of American firearms, without ever having to fight a single one of those legal battles itself. This is the story of Smith & Wesson, a company that failed at its first attempt at building firearms, succeeded spectacularly at its second by way of a deal that ruined the man who made it possible, and spent the following century and a half building some of the most iconic revolvers ever manufactured in the United States. Every week, we take apart the story stamped on the receiver of an American firearm, the founders, the factories, and the decisions that built a legend or lost one. Horace Smith and Daniel Baird Wesson first partnered in 1852 in Norwich, Connecticut, working on an entirely different kind of firearm than the one that would eventually make their names famous across the following century and a half of American manufacturing history. Their original venture developed the volcanic repeating pistol, a lever-action design firing a self-contained rocket ball cartridge financed by a businessman named Cortlandt Palmer, who held the underlying patent rights to the mechanism itself. The volcanic design showed real mechanical promise, but sold poorly enough that the company was renamed Volcanic Repeating Arms in 1855 and sold outright the following year to a shirt manufacturer named Oliver Winchester, who kept Wesson on briefly as a plant manager before Wesson departed the company entirely to pursue other opportunities. Winchester's own newly acquired firearms venture would eventually be reorganized twice more, first as the New Haven Arms Company, and finally by 1866 as the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, the same iconic American gunmaker this channel has already covered in its own right, built directly on top of the failed first venture. Smith & Wesson themselves had walked away from years earlier, an origin story neither company particularly advertised once both had become famous under their own separate names. Before we get into how their second attempt actually succeeded, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. Smith & Wesson reunited in November of 1856 to try again, this time pursuing an entirely different opportunity created by Samuel Colt's own original revolver patent, which was set to expire that same year and open the field to new competitors for the first time in decades of Colt's own near-total dominance of the American revolver market. Rather than simply copying Colt's percussion cap design once the patent expired, Wesson recognized that pairing a revolver with a self-contained metallic cartridge rather than the loose powder and ball every earlier revolver required a shooter to painstakingly load one chamber at a time would represent a genuine leap forward in reloading speed and battlefield reliability alike. That ambition required Rollin White's bored-through cylinder patent specifically, and the royalty arrangement the two men struck with White in exchange for exclusive use of his design gave Smith & Wesson something close to a legal monopoly on cartridge-firing revolvers for more than a decade, protected by a patent White himself bore full legal responsibility for defending in court, while Smith & Wesson simply collected the considerable commercial benefit of owning exclusive rights to it. The resulting Model 1 revolver, a small 7-shot 22 caliber rimfire pocket pistol, became the product that finally established Smith & Wesson as a serious firearms manufacturer in its own right rather than merely the failed predecessor of somebody else's eventual success story built on the ashes of their own first venture. Sales were strong enough within 2 years to fund the construction of the company's own purpose-built factory, and demand only accelerated once the Civil War began in 1861, with officers and soldiers on both sides of the conflict seeking out a genuinely modern cartridge-firing sidearm wherever they could actually find one to purchase privately, since the government contracts for standard-issue weapons rarely extended to a compact pocket revolver like the Model 1 itself, because the Rollin White patent gave Smith & Wesson exclusive legal control over cartridge revolvers until it finally expired in 1869. Competing manufacturers throughout the war years were largely locked out of the exact category of firearm that was rapidly becoming the most desirable sidearm in the entire country, an advantage built entirely on a licensing agreement the actual inventor had signed away for a quarter per gun and then spent the rest of his own career trying, mostly in vain, to actually enforce against infringers who had considerably less to lose than he did by simply ignoring his claim. The post-war decades brought steady mechanical refinement rather than any single dramatic reinvention, a pattern of incremental improvement rather than sudden leaps forward. Smith & Wesson introduced a series of top-break revolvers through the 1870s and 1880s, designs that let a shooter unlatch the barrel and tip it forward, automatically ejecting all spent cartridges simultaneously rather than requiring them to be picked out one at a time by hand, a genuine convenience advantage over Colt's competing designs that helped the company build a substantial civilian and law enforcement following on both sides of the Atlantic, including popularity among Russian military buyers, substantial enough that the Russian government alone placed a single order for 200,000 revolvers through the 1870s, one of the largest individual foreign military contracts any American arms manufacturer had received up to that point in the industry's own history. The company's hand ejector line, introduced around the turn of the 20th century, replaced the top brake mechanism with a solid frame and a cylinder that swung out sideways for reloading, the same basic swing-out cylinder configuration that remains the standard design for the overwhelming majority of double-action revolvers manufactured anywhere in the world today, more than a century after Smith & Wesson's own engineers first worked out the underlying mechanism through years of careful, incremental refinement. The company's reputation for raw power reached its defining moment in 1935 when Smith & Wesson introduced the .357 Magnum cartridge and the revolver built to fire it, a round loaded to considerably higher pressure than any standard revolver cartridge then available on the commercial market, marketed specifically to law enforcement officers who needed to penetrate the increasingly common automobile bodies and early body armor that standard service revolvers of the era found themselves struggling against during the Prohibition era's own escalating arms race between police and organized crime. 2 decades later, in 1955, the company went further still, introducing the .44 Magnum, a cartridge so powerful that Smith & Wesson's own promotional materials described it plainly as the most powerful handgun cartridge in the world at the time of its release, a claim that would go on to become genuine pop culture shorthand decades later once a fictional police detective in a 1971 film made the exact same phrase and the revolver chambered for it. Famous to an audience who had never fired a handgun of any kind in their entire lives and would recognize the phrase from the movie theater rather than a gun shop. The Second World War brought Smith & Wesson into large-scale military production for the first time in its history, manufacturing a wartime variant of its standard service revolver, informally known as the Victory model, and stamped with a distinctive serial number prefix that collectors still use today to identify wartime production examples with any real confidence, supplied in substantial numbers to American and Allied forces throughout the conflict, alongside continued civilian and law enforcement production wherever wartime material allocations actually allowed it to continue at any meaningful scale, despite the enormous demands the broader war effort placed on the same factories and the same skilled workers. The post-war decades brought corporate ownership changes that had little to do with the company's own product line or engineering culture, and everything to do with the broader wave of conglomerate acquisitions sweeping across American manufacturing during the same period. Smith & Wesson was acquired by the conglomerate Bangor Punta in 1965, passing later to another conglomerate, Lear Siegler, in 1984, before finally landing with the British industrial holding company Tompkins plc in 1987, an ownership structure that placed one of the most iconic names in American gunmaking under the control of a London-based conglomerate for the better part of 2 decades, a detail many of the company's own American customers remained largely unaware of throughout the entire period, buying revolvers stamped with a proudly American name from a factory that answered ultimately to shareholders on the other side of the Atlantic. By the late 1990s, Smith & Wesson found itself operating in an increasingly hostile legal environment that had little to do with the quality of its own products and everything to do with a broader wave of litigation targeting the entire American firearms industry simultaneously. Dozens of American cities, following the legal playbook that had already been used against the tobacco industry earlier in the decade, filed lawsuits against gun manufacturers, arguing that the industry bore some measure of responsibility for the broader social cost of gun violence, litigation that threatened every major manufacturer in the country with potentially ruinous legal exposure, regardless of how carefully any individual company had actually followed existing law. Smith & Wesson, facing that pressure more directly than most of its competitors and hoping to resolve the litigation threat through negotiation rather than years of costly courtroom battles, became the first major manufacturer willing to negotiate directly with the federal government over new voluntary restrictions, a decision that looked from inside the company's own boardroom like a pragmatic way to end an existential legal threat rather than the public relations catastrophe it would actually turn into within weeks. The company's most serious modern crisis arrived not from a competitor or a failed product, but from a political agreement that triggered a consumer backlash few executives at Smith & Wesson appear to have fully anticipated at the time they signed it. In March of 2000, under pressure from the Clinton administration and facing a wave of municipal lawsuits against firearms manufacturers filed by cities across the country, Smith & Wesson signed an agreement committing the company to a range of new safety and distribution restrictions on its own products, becoming the first major American gunmaker to do so at a moment when the rest of the industry was still resisting similar pressure entirely. The response from much of the company's own core customer base was immediate and severe. Gun owners, dealers, and rival manufacturers organized a boycott that devastated sales almost overnight. Dealers across the country pulling Smith & Wesson products from their own shelves in solidarity with a customer base that viewed the agreement as a betrayal rather than a reasonable compromise negotiated in good faith. Competing manufacturers seizing the opportunity to publicly position themselves as the industry's true defenders against government overreach, while Smith & Wesson's own market share collapsed month after month. Employees at the company's own Springfield, Massachusetts factory watched production orders dry up in real time, and Tompkins, watching its American subsidiary's value collapse in real time over the following months with no sign of the boycott easing, sold Smith & Wesson in May of 2001 to Safety Hammer Corporation, a considerably smaller firearms safety company most of Smith & Wesson's own longtime customers had never previously heard of, for a price far below what the storied brand had been worth only months earlier before the agreement was ever signed, a fire sale ending that closed out more than 3 decades of the company operating under one large industrial conglomerate after another. The years that followed the Safety Hammer acquisition brought a slow, deliberate rebuilding of the trust. The 2000 agreement had cost the company among its own core customer base. New leadership distanced the company from the earlier settlement, expanded its product line into the semi-automatic pistols and modern sporting rifles that were rapidly reshaping the broader American firearms market by the early 2000s, and rebuilt relationships with dealers and distributors who had pulled Smith & Wesson products from their shelves during the boycott years earlier, a slow and deliberate process of winning back trust one dealer relationship at a time, rather than any single dramatic gesture that could have reversed the damage overnight. By 2016, the company had grown substantial enough and diversified enough beyond firearms alone into outdoor and shooting sports accessories more broadly, that its parent corporation renamed itself American Outdoor Brands, a name change that reflected a company trying to present itself as something broader than a single controversial 2000 agreement had once threatened to define it as for a new generation of customers who might otherwise have never given the brand a second chance. This is not a story about a single inventor's brilliant idea carrying a company effortlessly across a century and a half of continuous success without any real setback along the way. It is a story about two men who failed once, tried again by licensing another man's patent on terms that would ruin him personally while enriching them enormously, built a genuine monopoly on the back of that arrangement, and then spent the following century absorbing every kind of disruption a firearms company can actually face. Corporate conglomerates more interested in balance sheets than engineering, a political agreement that alienated the exact customers who had built the brand's reputation in the first place over more than a century of trust, and a rescue from near collapse by a company most of Smith & Wesson's own longtime customers had never even heard of before the sale itself was announced in the press. Today, Smith & Wesson remains one of the largest handgun manufacturers in the United States. Its revolvers still built around the same basic swing, out-cylinder mechanism the company's engineers refined more than a century ago. Its name still carried by the .357 and .44 Magnum cartridges that made it famous to audiences who had never held a firearm in their lives outside a movie theater seat. Roland White, the man whose bored-through-cylinder patent made the entire company's early fortune possible, spent his own final years in comparative obscurity. Having spent much of what he earned defending a patent Smith & Wesson themselves never had to lift a finger to protect on his behalf, a quiet historical footnote behind one of the most recognizable names in the entire American firearms industry, a company whose earliest fortune rests more than anything else on a deal one exhausted, litigation-weary inventor eventually came to deeply regret ever signing in the first place, decades before either Smith or Wesson themselves lived to see just how large the company built on that single signature would eventually become. If you want more stories about the inventions that made someone else rich while their own creator was left defending them alone, subscribe and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.